It's so nice to see everybody. All right. Today we are continuing our discussion from last time. The topic is, can lay people be arahants? And typically, traditionally, it's said that as long as lay people are lay people, perhaps they can never put down sensual pleasures such as food, they can never put down money, sex, family. And I don't think that's true. So last time we talked about how to loosen attachments around food, music, money, and today we're going to continue the discussion with sex and family. And something that we talked about last time after the recording was paused was I brought up how I think it's really important to learn from multiple arahants because sometimes they say things that, at least at first first glance of the ear, they seem to directly contradict. So I think what's really interesting is these arahants experience absolute reality, and then they have to convey it with words and language and even their perception. These are all functions of conventional reality. So of course, they might be interpreted in different ways. So I think it's really important we listen from these enlightened masters. And then when we cross-reference what they're saying, especially when they seem to contradict, then we can piece together what is the absolute reality from that. So I have multiple examples of this, and if you want to hear more, we can talk about it during the discussion part. But one really great example is the different ways where they talk about sexuality. So for example, Ajahn Suchart has said in his Q&As that once someone becomes a sakadagami, which is a one-partner, then they no longer experience sexual desire. Interesting. Then Ajahn Sumedho actually recently talked about sexual desire, sexuality, sexual arousal, whatever you want to call it, in one of his Dhamma talks. And he said it's just this thing that our body experiences, that these sensory objects, they just once in a while experience sexual arousal, and it's nothing to celebrate, nothing to condemn. It's just a thing that happens. Interesting. I would say, like, as a person who lives in this body that ovulates once a month, that for 2 days of the month, there is just this flood of hormones and there's sexual arousal, and there's nothing to celebrate and condemn about it. I think it says nothing about the depth of my practice or the richness of my practice. And in fact, when my mind is very still, the signal of the arousal comes across more clearly because there's no static in my mind to distract from it or to cloud the signal. It's just sexual arousal. Who cares? It's all the stories that people attach to it that cause problems. Like, oh, like I experience so much of this sensation. I must be young and fertile. I must be very attractive. My worth as a human being is validated by people desiring me in this way, blah, blah, blah. That can cause a lot of problems, lots of sense of self, lots of suffering. Or the opposite, like, I experience no arousal. I must be an arhat. Ha ha ha. Also lots of stories, also lots of sense of self. Or, the opposite of the story of sexual arousal too is like, oh my gosh, I experienced sexual arousal. I must be a horrible practitioner. I think that is a story that sometimes very serious practitioners also tell themselves. And it's just a sensation in the way that we do not need to celebrate or condemn a yawn or a sneeze. Like, we do not need to celebrate or condemn sexual arousal. I think when I cross-reference what the two teachers are saying, Ajahn Suchart and Ajahn Sumedho, both of whom I respect as arahants, um, I think there's not necessarily actually contradiction either, because I think what they might be saying in common is that once somebody crosses a certain milestone of practice, whether it's Sakadagami or later, I don't know, then maybe they do become asexual. However, there are many, many different ways that a person can be asexual. And this is something that I learned really deeply when I read this book called ACE, ACE, ACE. That is the verbal shorthand for asexual. It's written by an author named Angela Chen. And this is not overtly a Dhamma book. But when I read it, it really deconstructed relationships, attraction, and sexuality for me in a way that was really helpful for my practice. So in this book, which I highly recommend, I really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. This author is saying that, the A in LGBTQIAP+, the A stands for asexual. And there are so many different ways that people can embody asexuality and practice. I don't know if practice is the right word for an identity, but there are many expressions of this way of being. So for example, on one side of the spectrum, there's people who do not want to think about sex, maybe are even repulsed by the idea of sex. And then there are also people who are sexually active in their partnerships, and they see sex as just a way to give pleasure to the partner. It is a way to experience pleasure themselves, but it's also not something that's very important, not something they go out of their way to get. Some people who let their partners know, hey, if you want to experience sexuality, I'm totally here for you. I'm happy to provide that. But it's not something that I'm going to initiate. So there was one person in the book who compared sexual activity to if a partner needs a massage, like a massage after a long day, and they're happy to give it and they have pleasure in providing that massage to their partner, but it's not something that they crave, not something that they're attached to. Yeah, many ways to practice asexuality, many ways that it can express itself in people, even when they're lay people, even when they are sexually active. So I think the traditional and classic way of practicing with putting down attachment to sex is renunciation and celibacy. And this was something that was extremely helpful in my practice at a certain time in my life. I think I was actually had just experienced a really horrible, empty episode of sexual activity with someone. And I closed my eyes and I just saw, it was kind of like in Looney Tunes, the cartoon, when there's a cartoon character who falls through the awning of a window, only to fall through another awning of a window. And they keep falling through these awnings until they plummet into the sidewalk in a crater in the concrete. I saw a vision of myself as that cartoon character, except there was no sidewalk to break the fall. There was just window awning after window awning. And these window awnings were all the people that I had been engaged with in sexual and romantic relationships. And I really had this deep knowing in my body then that for my whole life, from puberty until that moment, I had been careening from partner to partner, looking for some kind of validation outside of myself. If I am desired as a sexual object, then perhaps then I will be validated as a human being. And I saw in that moment that if I didn't really intentionally practice celibacy for a good long while, I was just going to keep careening from person to person, falling from window awning to window awning. And I was like, okay, yeah, let's be celibate for a while. And that was an extremely helpful practice for a long time, just to put down those attachments to being a desirable sexual person to other people. So that's an amazing way to practice. I love practicing with celibacy. And it's also not the only way for people to practice with putting down attachment to sex. I think there was also a lot of fruit from the practice of just that precept of not engaging with sexual misconduct. And this is something I practiced with my partner very deeply because, we have both survived a fair share of sexual abuse. So in our relationship, anytime there's even a hint of a breath of a whisper of pressure to engage in sexual activity, it's really bad news. And our bodies just shut down and it's just not fun for anybody. And we figured out that, on one hand, there's a lot of societal pressure on, at least in the early days of our relationship, a lot of stories that we had heard from culture, from society, that if it's a healthy relationship, then it's sexually active. If I am loved by my partner, then there's sexual activity. So on one hand, there's those stories, right? And on the other hand, there's the truth of our bodies that if there is a hint of a breath of a whisper of pressure, it's bad news. Okay. So these things were contradicting, and we basically had to choose as a partnership and as individuals ourselves, like, do we give into those stories, or do we honor our bodies and what our bodies are needing and asking of us? And of course, we chose our well-being over the BS of society. And we figured out that in our relationship, that even if one person is really wanting something, wanting sexual activity, if the other person has even a hint of a no, then we can express that. And we want to encourage each other to really express that. And then the person who wants it more will just be like, okay, love you. Later, we'll do something else. And it's like that, no pressure, not just in what we say, not what we do, but because we're both really sensitive to each other's feelings, like we really have to mean it completely for us to be mentally well, bodily well. And it's like, yeah, I love Kyle so much, and I think Kyle loves me so much that we want to practice to that point of consent and that point of bodily agency. And I think without even knowing it, through this practice, we were also putting down attachment to sex, because our love and our respect for each other was so much more important. And I feel like when love, morality, all these things we choose these things over and over again and place them at a higher priority than sex or than money, then very naturally the attachment to sex, money, food just is naturally put down. Okay, so that's what I want to say about working with sexual activity and sexual arousal. I mean, like, we don't get all hung up on whether or not we sneeze or yawn. We don't need to get hung up on whether we have sex either. They're all just things that happen in the body. At least that's what I think. Okay, let's talk about family. And before I go into putting down the attachment of family, and for me specifically, this would be putting down my attachment to Kyle. I think it's important for me to talk about the depth of my feeling for Kyle, is that there's multiple levels of truth, right? There's absolute truth, in which there's not really a me, there's not really any of you, there's not really a Kyle, there's not even really love. All of these things are empty phenomena. So in absolute truth, I love everybody the same as I love me. I love everybody the same as I love Kyle. Okay, because really ultimately there's nobody there. And then in conventional reality, I love Kyle the most in the whole entire world. Okay, I care about Kyle the most. Kyle makes me laugh the hardest, feel the safest, inspires me to practice the most. If I died today, Kyle's face would be the last thing that I wish to see before I die. And Kyle's hand in mine would be the last sensation I hope to feel in this world before I die. Okay, so in absolute reality, I love everybody the same. In conventional reality, I love Kyle the absolute most. I love Kyle the whole world. Okay, I think this is important to say, because even when we love someone like that, we can work with putting down that attachment and loosening that attachment. So there are a few things that have been extremely helpful in working with my attachment to Kyle. I think the first thing is just having this foundation in our relationship of wishing each other to be happy and free, even if it's without me in Kyle's life. Okay, and I think this really started one day when Kyle was about to leave on retreat. And then after Kyle's retreat, I was going to go on retreat. So really, we were saying goodbye for like 2 weeks or so. And this is hard. Like, even one night without each other, or one afternoon without each other, I miss Kyle. So we were both kind of agitated that morning, and like, Kyle's way of dealing with agitation is to be very busy. So I think Kyle was like checking their packing list 20 times. My way of dealing with the agitation of missing Kyle is to become very droopy and to like drape myself across the couch and be like, oh. But like right before Kyle left, right before they left the door, walked out the door with their luggage, I was like, hey, like come over here. Like maybe we can use this as a chance to practice. And maybe we can use this as a chance to practice when one of us dies first. And we can practice saying our last words to each other. And oh my gosh, I'm a very dramatic person, I realize as I say this out loud. But Kyle was saying, like, okay, like my last words to you would be, I want you to know that I miss you so much and I'm gonna miss you the whole time. And what would your last words be? And I kind of thought about it, and like from my belly came my last words of, I just want you to be happy and free. When you go, just practice. Like, don't, if you, the thoughts of me arise and the thoughts of missing me arise, then that's fine. But if they don't, it's perfectly fine. And whatever happens, just be happy and free with or without me. And this is something that we talk about once in a while, like especially when we come upon a difficult conversation or a difficult chapter of our relationship. Sometimes we'll talk very openly, like, I want you to be happy and free. Like, does that look like a life with me? Does that look like a life without me? Like, what is the best for you? What is the best for your practice? And I love that for the foundation of our relationship, and has been very helpful. It's like baked into our relationship and into the way that we love each other is this wish for non-attachment to each other also. And I think one example that comes to mind for this is, you know, when we went on pilgrimage to Thailand, it blew up my life so much and shook me to my core and moved me in these seismic ways that when I came home, all my close friends and people, even people at work, even my therapist, everyone was like, so are you going to ordain or what? I fired that therapist, by the way. But I was like, my life was really in chaos and I had so much inner turmoil because I felt like in Thailand I fell in love so deeply, like even more deeply than ever with the Dhamma, with the tradition, the Thai forest tradition, you know, even the color of the robes, the victory banner of the Arahants, that specific color of orange brown, like it makes my heart glow even just thinking of that color. So I was really changed. And yeah, part of my mind was, a large part of my mind actually was like, oh my gosh, should I ordain? do I want to do I want to start a life in the robes? And everybody, even around me, everybody was really suggesting slash pressuring me to do this. And I think something that moved me so deeply was, you know, Kyle's very sensitive and very smart, so Kyle knew what was happening. And Kyle kind of just sat me down and said, do you want to ordain? And I was really ready to defend myself or to assure Kyle or even for them to be mad at me. But what they said next was, it's okay if you do. And that dazzled me. And even now, like the depth of love that it takes, the depth of unconditional love it takes for the person who has the most to lose to say, for me, it's okay if you want to leave me. Like, I feel it in my toes right now. And it was that permission and that space and that encouragement for me to be as happy and free as I could that really allowed me to go into a meditation. I said, I need to think about this. I don't know. And I went into meditation, and I've talked about this space in my heart before with one of you before. But when there's so much conflict between all the things that I want, when there's so much pressure externally to do things a certain way, there's this like really deep, intimate place in my heart where I can go in meditation. And with this like pure dedication to the truth, I can bring a question to that place in my heart in meditation, ask that question there, put aside all the fears of blowing up my life, all the fears of disappointing people and hurting people. And I just asked, what is the best for my practice? And the answer that I got that day in my heart was to stay with Kyle, stay as a layperson. And yeah, I think all of us have that place in our hearts. All of us have that place where we can go and be totally nakedly, brutally honest with ourselves. And I think when we have confusing questions like that, at least for me, when I take that question to that place in my heart, I only need to ask it one time, and then I know. So, yes, the freedom to be happy and free, the encouragement and the sincere desire for each other in relationship to be happy and free. That has been very helpful. And then a while later, something else happened that was like another milestone in my practice of loosening this attachment to the person I love the most, to Kyle. Was one day we were having an argument because I thought I knew what was best for Kyle's practice that day. And Kyle did not agree. And I'm laughing because it is like coming from a pure sense of self when I go around and I say, I know what's best for your practice. I mean, come on. I don't know. I don't know what's best for anybody's practice. Only that person knows, right? But of course, that day we were butting heads, and I don't even remember what specifically it was that I wanted Kyle to do, but Kyle was like, I'm not doing it. And also, will you please, I beg of you, investigate where is this coming from that you are pressuring me to do this so strongly? And I was like, darn it, I got called out. My sense of self got called out. So I was like, okay, I promise I'll investigate this. And as I was sitting with it, I had this image just blaze into my mind of me tossing a pair of car keys at Kyle. And to me, that really meant like, I cannot drive your car. I cannot drive the car of your practice. You got to drive that car yourself. I cannot even hold on to your keys. You got to hold on to the keys yourself. And we all just have to practice for ourselves. It's like Ajahn Sumedho emphasizes quite often, the Dhamma is individually realized. I can't practice for anybody else, and nobody can practice for me. So that boundary became very clear. And shortly after that, I saw the same image of tossing the car keys, but it wasn't one pair of car keys toward Kyle. It was like 8 billion car keys in every direction of the world. Like, everybody just practice for yourself. No one's practice is my business. Okay, like the best I can do is be a cheerleader when someone asks me to cheerlead, or to be a source of support when someone asks me to be a source of support. And that is the best I can do. That is all I can do. Yeah, healthy boundaries there. Very helpful. And then came a few months later, another milestone in my practice of putting down this attachment to the love of my life. It was like January or February of this year when I don't know why the impulse emerged so strongly to practice death contemplation with Kyle. I don't know where it came from. And contemplating my own death has never had much teeth to it, but contemplating Kyle's death has always been something that struck terror through my whole being. But then sometime in January or February of this year, I don't know why, but I just felt this impulse where in the evenings, a lot of the times we'll watch TV together and we'll just hang out on the couch with our dog. But then I I couldn't even help it. We would be watching some silly show, and then all of a sudden I would just be contemplating that one of us will have to die. Statistically, Kyle's 10 years older than me, and Kyle is assumed male at birth. So statistically, Kyle's going to die first. And, even if Kyle doesn't leave me by death, like, it's not impossible that they leave me by choice one day. But the fact is, we are going to have to part. One day, Kyle is going to leave me. And I was like, just bursting into tears every night. Like, truly out of nowhere. Like, we would just be sitting there cuddling the dog, and I would just start weeping. And Kyle would just look at me like, what is wrong. I'd be like, I can't help it. You're gonna die. So this happened for like 2 or 3 weeks at minimum. Okay, like seriously, almost every night I would just weep on the couch out of nowhere spontaneously. And every time Kyle would think that something was terribly wrong. And every time I'd be like, no, it's just your eventual death. Just leave me. Don't look at me. Um, and so this happened regularly until, ironically, on Valentine's Day, on the night of Valentine's Day, this feeling arose like out of my belly. It was rising in my chest, this grief for Kyle's death. But then before it actually got all the way up to my eyeballs and emerged as tears, like all of a sudden, it kind of felt like a chiropractic adjustment on my spine, except it was like really deep in my heart. All of a sudden, there was just this deep knowing that I was going to be okay. And that the grief, when it does hit, whether Kyle leaves me by death or by choice, or whether I die first, the grief of leaving Kyle is going to be immense. It's going to be terrible. I will be on my knees weeping. I know that for a fact. And my mind, my chitta is greater than that, because any feeling, even one as scary and as big and as awful as mourning my partner's death, even that is finite. But the chitta is infinite. Anything, even when it's so big, even anything when it's compared to infinity is nothing. And ever since then, I've been telling Kyle, I love you unconditionally. I love you even if or when you'll leave me. I love you so much. I love you infinity. I think that I've heard some debate with Dhamma practitioners. There's this part in the suttas where the Buddha, his two chief disciples have just died, and he says, like, these halls are empty without them. And sometimes I hear debate of whether or not the Buddha is suffering in that moment. And I think the answer is yes. Like, he is both suffering and not suffering. So the word suffering, it means multiple things. And I really think this debate is one of semantics. Ajahn Sumedho, he says in his Dhamma talks, for example, I still suffer. Um, okay, so the way I think about it for me is, if you imagine whatever room that you're sitting in right now, imagine there's like a clear glass tube or pipe going from the ceiling to the floor. Maybe it's about like this wide around. And anytime you have a thought or a feeling, it's like a little bit of water coming through the pipe, washing from the ceiling to the floor. So if it's a little thought or a little feeling, if the feeling is fleeting, if it's something very trivial, it's just a little bit of a trickle of water. If the feeling is very, very big, then it is like a gush, maybe even gushes for weeks and weeks. Maybe the pipe is completely full of water. Maybe it gushes for a very long time. So I think for an arahant, they are able to watch the feeling in the glass pipe as it washes through. I think for someone who is not quite as trained, not quite as well practiced as the arahant, there are inside the pipe, and it's like they're getting slimed in Nickelodeon. Okay, they're just getting, the deluge is going on top of their head. Maybe they're drowning in it. So I think in that situation, the Buddha was sad about his chief disciples dying. I mean, gosh, who wouldn't be? And there was a lot of gushing in the tube, in the pipe. But I think he was watching it from outside of the pipe. So in that way, he was not suffering. Okay. If that was confusing, let me know. Okay. I also wanted to talk about last time. It was funny because as soon as the recording stopped, a lot of people had really beautiful shares and questions. And one of the really great questions was, how do I know if something is preference versus an attachment? And I would encourage everybody to find the best way to discern that for themselves. I wanted to share the best way for me to discern that for myself is that it really comes from like when I think of that thing, whether it's food, money, sex, partner, like where is the energy in my body? So an example is I remember for a couple of years we were trying desperately to conceive a biological child. And every time it didn't work, I knew in my head, I would lecture myself, oh, like this is just a preference, like you will be fine even if you never conceive. But in my body, there was so much tightness and clenching and craving and just, oh, like if I don't have this thing, what's going to happen? Like I just want it so desperately. It just felt so tight, so clenched. Versus now, like even when I think of the pregnancy loss that we experienced, in my head, I know like, oh my gosh, that was like one of the hardest times in my life. In my head, I know how bereft I was. In my head, I remember wailing into Kyle's chest, but my body feels relaxed and calm. And this can also be applied to pleasures, not just painful experiences. So, for example, I really enjoy dancing and playing fun hip hop R&B, especially when I cook. Last night I was like cooking this casserole and I was like dancing around the kitchen while I was washing the vegetables and cutting the vegetables and sticking it in the oven. It was a very pleasurable experience. But when I think of just as a thought experiment, what would happen if I woke up one day and all the music had vanished from the place of off the face of the earth? Putting aside the confusion as to how that would happen, just as a thought experiment, like in my head, I think, oh, that's a bummer. That was a really fun experience. It would have been really fun to have that experience for the rest of my life. But in my body, it just feels relaxed and like a shrug. So that's my favorite way to discern the difference. I also think it is really smart and skillful to be open to being wrong at any point, just about anything in life, really, which for someone to be a little bit open to being wrong all the time can be terrifying. But I think for someone to be all the way open to being wrong all the time is freedom. And sometimes when we make mistakes and we think we are not attached to something anymore, and it turns out we are, just like any mistake in life, we can use that as a foothold in our practice up the steep mountain of practice, the steep mountain climb toward Nibbana. So an example is in Stillness Flowing, favorite book that I read a couple years ago, but has obviously stuck with me so much, is Lumpur Cha at a certain point must have thought that he was at a point in practice when he would not be angry anymore. But then some, fiasco happened in the monastery and he was shocked to find that he was angry about it. So if I remember correctly in the story, he dropped everything in that moment and he announced, I'm going to meditate in my kuti until I cross the finish line of Nibbana. And then he went into his kuti. He emerged 10 days later. So one might say that even though he had assumed he was further along than he actually was, like the indignation that he felt when he discovered that he was actually still capable of being angry, perhaps could have expedited his path to cross that finish line, because it inspired him to retreat for 10 days until he was ready to emerge as an Arahant. So sometimes it can be very fun to be wrong. We've been talking so far about can lay people be Arahants, and obviously this whole time I've been saying like, yes, I think it is. Why not? I cannot think of a single valid reason why they cannot. But I also want to be clear that that does not mean I necessarily think that everybody's practice will be the most efficient and swiftest if they are a lay person, if they remain the lay person. I also do not think that everybody will have the swiftest and most efficient practice if they're monastic, and if someone watching this, or if you know someone who is really grappling with what to do about their practice, I would really encourage, especially if they have a strong foundation in practice already, really encourage for whoever is confused to also take that question into that innermost, intimate, deep place in their heart, that place where they can put aside all the fear of hurting people, all that fear of disappointing people, and really just ask so sincerely, what is the best for my practice? And then see what comes from there. And yes, why not? Why can lay people not do it? Why can you all, I'm looking at all your faces individually that are on screen, why can we not do it? Why can't we at the very least make as much progress as we can? And I think there were parts of my practice when it was really important for me to think that I could. And then there were parts of my practice where it was really important and useful for me to just not care about it at all anymore and just think every day I'm going to wake up and practice as hard as I can for the joy of it. And because it doesn't matter how far I get, it just matters that I do my best every single day. So, whichever one of those mentalities fits you best right now, try it on and just pick up what works for you and what's going to get you most excited to practice every day. All right, that's all I got for you today. I would love to hear any reflections that are coming up for you, any questions, any thoughts. Let's hear it. You know what happened last time was I think nobody wanted to be on the recording. So we can also stop the recording and then just talk freely without being on the record of the internet. So I'll say, if you want to share on the recording, do it. Going once, going twice, and let's stop the recording. Thank you very much.